The following program is rated PG and may contain scenes of violence, nudity, coarse language, and mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
Through human history, humanity has harnessed the forces of nature for good. Wind power, solar power, and the power of water.
If we release 1.2 billion cubic meters of water, massive destruction is going to occur downstream.
Battering waves, 10 meters of water coming in there.
We're seeing an increase in the frequency and intensity of hazards such as forest fires due to climate change. These are becoming more and more common. They're giving us a glimpse into what our future is looking like it's going to hold for us.
Once unleashed, the forces of nature are a power that science and technology cannot tame on this planet.
It's astounding to think of the damage that was able to take place in under 1 minute. Over 200,000 people were dead.
Or beyond.
Wouldn't you necessarily know what the heck you're looking at? It would have been absolutely beautiful and amazing, but I can imagine it would be like, oh, okay, that's it, we're done. This is the end of the world.
Fire could be the first technology humans ever used. Because of fire, we were able to cook our food, keep warm, and light up the night. But untamed, fire is a nearly unstoppable force of nature, one that Eastern Australia knows all too well.
In 2019, and generally conditions that spark wildfire or bushfire, as it's called in Australia, would be drier than normal conditions for several weeks or months leading up to fire season.
2019 was one of the hottest and driest years ever recorded in Australia. The hot, dry conditions would continue, and by November 2019, the temperatures reached unprecedented levels.
Catastrophic fire danger was declared in the Greater Sydney region. This is an area that is home to about 5 million people.
So in Australia, where the temperature's getting hotter year after year and drier and wildfires are coming up and being more prevalent, the question is why aren't people taking notice of this?
This was the first time since the introduction of this level in 2009 that a fire danger had been declared in Greater Sydney.
Because of these extreme hot and dry conditions, Australia was in grave danger.
The bushfires that started earlier in the year grew out of control by December. The hot, dry weather made things so much worse. The Sydney metropolitan area suffered from dangerous smoky haze for several days throughout December. The haze made the sky look almost apocalyptic.
The smoke only grew worse, choking the east coast of Australia with little relief in sight.
By December, the fire hazard was extreme and multiple fires were recorded all around the east coast of Australia. There were massive coalescing fires engulfing entire communities, engulfing farm cropland.
The hardest hit areas were the large Northern Territory of Australia, where nearly 70,000 square kilometers were burned. New South Wales, Australia's most populated state, lost over 2,400 buildings and suffered 28 fatalities. And the health effects of the weeks of smoke are still unknown.
But it was the entire east coast of Australia that suffered during the Black Summer.
By October, the bushfire had grown so large and in so many locations that this was considered to be one of the most extreme bushfires years of any that Australia had experienced. A total of 143,000 square kilometers of land had been burned, which is roughly the size of New York State.
The fires destroyed over 3,000 buildings, many of them homes, and killed at least 34 people. And the devastation to wildlife was apocalyptic.
One of the major effects of the Black Summer bushfire season in Australia in 2019 were the impacts on animals.
And while bushfires are a natural occurrence in Australia, they have never been this massive. These unnaturally large wildfires have had deadly consequences for the wildlife of the country.
Something like 3 billion animals were estimated to have been killed during the bushfire, the majority of those reptiles. And in some cases, scientists estimate that some species were actually made extinct by this one bushfire season.
Is climate change to blame for the unprecedented calamity? And more than 1 year later, has life returned to normal for the survivors who lost their homes and livelihood as a result of the disaster?
Everybody knew that the potential for a larger event was on the horizon, and I think there's a clear understanding that this could happen again and could even be larger in the future.
Years later, Australia is still reeling from the 2019-2020 fire season. As people look for answers, scientists believe the key to this disaster is human-made.
Climate change is changing the hazard profile overall. We're seeing an increase in the frequency and intensity of hazards such as forest fires due to climate change. 2020 marked yet again another particularly intense forest fire activity period.
Climate change is unequivocally increasing the fire danger in Australia. These fires came at the end of the hottest year on record, with extremely dry conditions. The fires, once they started, were almost impossible to control.
Australia has set multiple temperature records over the last 5 to 10 years, and bushfire areas burned records. So there's really a need for Australians and the global community to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, Australia mines coal and burns coal and exports coal for energy production. And every ton of coal that's burned adds additional CO2 and greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which is creating warmer conditions and better bushfire conditions.
While Australia fights its own climate catastrophe, the wildfires themselves are a feature of the country that date back millennia.
Australia is no stranger to fires. Fire is a reoccurring hazard that threatens the Australian landscape every year. In fact, many parts of Australia's ecosystem are actually reliant on fire to maintain a healthy and functional ecosystem. Gum trees, eucalyptus in particular, are reliant on fire for part of their natural life cycle.
Eucalyptus trees are native to Australia, but are now common in California and the warmer states of America.
They need fire to continue to grow and reproduce and maintain a healthy population. So fire, under a normal, proper forest management cycle, is simply part of the natural order of things.
While fire is an important part of the eucalyptus forest's regeneration cycle, are there ways to make the fire safer for the land and the people that live nearby?
Having a robust community emergency plan that takes into account the hazards of your area, particularly if you are in the urban wildland interface, so meaning if you do have a forest nearby, or you do have grassland or some other type of natural vegetation nearby. All communities have to ensure that they have an emergency plan. It's incredibly important because this cannot be something that's thrown together at the last minute.
While wildfires are part of the natural cycle, there are things we can do to protect our communities from the force of nature. We can build in non-fire-prone areas and conduct controlled burns to help the natural cycle of wildfires safely. But the most important step we can take is to minimize our CO2 emissions and hopefully stop the ravages of climate change. With wildfires raging across Australia, there is another elemental force of nature with deadly potential: water. We often see fire as a destroyer and water as a life-bringer. But once unleashed, water has a nearly unmatched potential for destruction. In China, 1975, an entire nation would be at the element's mercy. Early August of 1975, Typhoon Nina is barreling across the sea.
Typhoon Nina was a very typical as best you can say, tropical storm that began over the Pacific. As Nina came ashore, it weakened as all storms do, but the storm, Nina, dropped all of its rain very quickly. And as is always with these storms, it's where that rain landed that caused all the problems.
While Nina pounded China with rain, the country's many dams braced for the higher than normal water levels.
China has more than 98,000 dams. Many of these dams are used to manage flood risk and to generate electricity, among other uses. During flooding periods, dams can be vulnerable if they're not properly constructed. If a dam were to burst, it would be catastrophic for the settlements downstream from the dam. We're talking about millions of lives that would be at stake in this type of a scenario.
One of China's many dams was the Banqiao Dam. Completed in 1952, the dam was designed to help with flood mitigation and power generation.
In the 1950s, the Chinese built the Banqiao Dam. This dam was constructed to hold water back and to control the flow of water, and also to generate hydroelectricity. It was about 24.5 meters tall and held back a vast amount of water. It was a very long dam. The reservoir that the Banqiao Dam retained was absolutely massive. It was 492 million cubic meters. This is a massive amount of water.
But in August of 1975, it would face something unforeseen.
On August 6th, the typhoon had substantially impacted the communication infrastructure such that the chain of command was unable to effectively pass information using any sort of technology, pass along information that was critical to making decisions in a crisis. And the crisis that everyone found themselves in at this moment was whether or not to open the dam to allow for water to pass through. The dam itself was at a critical point where there was a very substantial chance of sustaining damage if the dam was not opened. And there was also a lot of risk to allowing waters to pass downstream, as there were a number of conditions downstream that were creating additional risk. And the slowdown of information exchange was really a very troublesome point in resolving this particular part of the crisis.
The engineers at Banqiao petitioned the government again on August 7th, but their telegram was delayed because of the destruction left in Nina's wake.
One of the most essential parts of effective and rapid response is enabling or empowering decision makers with correct and accurate and timely information. But as soon as that moment has passed and you no longer have the opportunity to leverage that information, it's basically redundant. And so the ways by which you exchange that information either allow you to or hinder you to be effective in your response.
Unfortunately, it was too late. On August 8th, water at the Banqiao Dam crested higher than the wave protection wall. The dam soon crumbled, unleashing a massive torrent of water.
This is a 10-meter high wall of water continuously flowing downstream. Downstream of this dam are other dams to control the flow of water in this river. If that dam bursts, many thousands of people are going to die when that water moves downstream.
By August 9th, the dikes on the Quan River collapsed. The entire Linquan County in Fuyang, Anhui was flooded.
Suya Lake, which is downstream from the Banqiao Dam, holds 1.2 billion cubic meters of water. This is a massive amount of water. And when all of this water flows down from the failed Banqiao Dam, it has the potential to fail the dam at Lake Suya that's holding those 1.2 billion cubic meters of water back. If we release 1.2 billion cubic meters of water, massive destruction is going to occur downstream. The risk of the Suya Dam failing is huge, and the Chinese recognize this. So they start to try and relieve the water that's accumulating in Lake Suya. They start blowing smaller dams around the lake to try and divert the water, and in doing so they're actually flooding the countryside, but they're doing it in a controlled manner so that we don't get a giant wall of water and we just slowly fill up the countryside. So they're using aircraft bombing. It's a lot like what was done in World War II in dam busting, is that they're dropping bombs onto these dams in order to destroy them. They're using TNT and explosives to blow up certain parts of the dams so that we can control where this water goes and so it doesn't destroy homes and farmland with a giant wall of water.
A total of 62 dams failed in the disaster, and entire villages were swept away by the waves.
The Ban Chao response required a significant collaborative, coordinated response due to the sheer number of people affected. Think for a moment what an individual requires on a day-to-day basis in terms of food, clothing, shelter, water, medical care. Many of the people affected, and remember, we're talking millions of people, lost everything they have. The response had to care for all of those millions of people. So we're looking at all of a sudden coordinating shelter, health care, and essential care for millions.
While it's obvious that the incident itself has caused catastrophic damage, tens of thousands of deaths, the numbers differ slightly depending on where they come from, but it's agreed upon that generally it's a very, very large number of people who died in the immediate aftermath of the event. What's really worth noting as well is that the cascading loss of access to critical resources, critical materials, food, fresh water, and things that are required to sustain day-to-day life, the absence of these things actually significantly increased the casualties that were associated with this death. And so we can look at this disaster as a two-part type event. One is the actual collapse of the dam itself and the deaths and injuries associated with that, but there's also the piece that needs to be examined of the consequences after the fact upon the local population and those who were impacted by the cascading events.
The Ban Chao Dam collapse would be labeled a natural disaster by the Chinese government, but human error may have played a huge part in the disaster.
Following the Second World War, China had its own civil war, a war which was won by Mao Zedong and his Communist Party. In the ensuing decades, China took its first steps forward as a communist power, but those steps were shaky.
An example of this would be the backyard furnace fiasco during the Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1962.
In an attempt to boost the country's steel production and bring it further into the industrial age, Mao Zedong instituted a policy that requested farmers to build steel forges in their backyards. The consequences of this decision were momentous because forging steel, not only was it dangerous, it was difficult, and the resulting steel was often of extremely low quality. Mao's relationship with science often took second place to the politics of the time. One of his primary goals was to increase the agricultural productivity of Chinese farmers. To that end, he instituted a policy of killing sparrows that he thought were feasting on seed grain. However, the sparrows themselves actually ate locusts, and in the wake of their deaths, the locust population blossomed, destroying many more crops than killing sparrows saved.
Due to the explosion of locusts and that farmers were busy making iron, not toiling their land, Chinese agriculture was hit hard, and starvation soon hit the nation. Construction of the Ban Chao Dam began in April of 1951 with the help of experts from the Soviet Union.
So when we build dams, we have to be very careful of the materials we use and even the soils underneath the dam. And clay materials, clay is very slippery, easily sheared material. And if we put clay at the base of our dam, as we build pressure behind our dam, the whole dam itself can slide on this layer of clay and be pushed out of the way. So when we're designing dams, we really have to avoid the use of clay materials. And the Chinese, when they were building this dam, didn't really have that technical understanding, and they had asked the Soviets for help. And the Soviets warned that this construction technique had this flaw, had this clay in the bottom of the dam that potentially could allow the whole dam to literally slide out of position.
The dam was completed in 1952. Cracks began to appear in the dam and its sluice gates. With the help of Soviet experts, the dam was reinforced and dubbed the Iron Dam. But not everyone was impressed with the so-called Iron Dam.
Sometimes specialists are seen as professional pessimists or professional worriers. And in fact, it is their profession or it's their job and their obligation to identify all the risks associated with a particular action.
The lead designer on the project, Chen Xing, felt that the design of the dam was inadequate. Proposing the use of stronger materials, as well as 12 sluice gates for better control of water flow, Chen was ignored, and the dam was built with only 5 sluice gates.
Decision makers who are now presented with these risks have to make different decisions and are met with competing interests or competing priorities that don't necessarily align with what the specialists are recommending on what types of actions to take and move forward. And while the engineer and while Shin identified correctly so many of the risks and the exposures to potential loss that were inherently found in the situation and ultimately did manifest and realize in a catastrophe, the decision makers who decided to implement the project and take action on it had a different vision of how it was meant to be realized, but we see that there's a very significant disjoint.
The Banqiao Dam collapse really exemplifies a process that we see happening in many regimes across the second half of the 20th century, a process in which science plays second fiddle to politics, and political considerations come first and foremost, regardless of the cost of bad science.
Unfortunately for Chen and the people of China, the government did not heed his warnings.
In retrospect, when we look back at this dam failure, the Chinese government was warned by the lead engineer and the Soviets of the design shortcomings, the clay layer under the dam, the lack of sufficient sluice gates, and ultimately those were likely the cause for this dam failure. So this really falls squarely on the Chinese government. They didn't take the steps that were needed to ensure this dam was safe, and they were rushing into progress. They weren't taking the time to make sure they were doing it right.
The Banqiao Dam failure continues to be classified as a natural disaster by the Chinese government, though steps behind the scenes are being taken to avoid another disaster.
There are still currently thousands of dams in use across China, and the Chinese government has been assessing the safety standards that are employed in those dams to ensure that a disaster like this has a low chance of happening ever again.
The Banqiao Dam showed how important it is to build using the right materials to help protect our human world from natural disasters. But what happens when you build to protect yourself from one type of disaster that leaves you vulnerable to a forgotten danger? Around 4:53 p.m. on January 12, 2010, residents around the Caribbean islands reported trembling. While it might have felt minor in some of the islands, it was anything but minor in Haiti.
People often don't think of earthquakes when they think of the Caribbean, but they actually are a semi-regular occurrence in parts of the Caribbean. There have been earthquakes that have struck Trinidad, Martinique, and Jamaica, just to name a few. But while earthquakes are relatively common, the quake of 2010 would turn out to be something completely different. It would turn into a disaster.
The tremor's epicenter was located outside the Haitian town of Léogâne, located about 40 kilometers west of the capital of Haiti, Port-au-Prince.
The violent shaking of the magnitude 7.1 earthquake lasted approximately 35 seconds. People were flung about and dust rose from the ground as buildings started to crumble around people. Loud noises as buildings came crashing down and glass broke from windows. Everything would have been so chaotic for the poor people who were living through this horrific event. You really have to imagine how horrific it would have been to have your world essentially crumbling around you.
Making things worse, every single hospital in the city was damaged or destroyed. The airport and seaports crumbled, and most of the roads buckled, making them unusable.
Many landmarks of historical and cultural value essentially disintegrated before people's very eyes. Unfortunately, the damage was so severe in many cases that it simply wasn't possible to rebuild these buildings. Many of them had to be demolished. These were of extreme importance to the culture of the people of Haiti.
During the earthquake, two of the notable buildings that collapsed and became front-page news were the Notre Dame Cathedral and the Capitol Building. And the Capitol Building being the seat of power and prestige and a symbol of government, that was quite a blow, I think, to the government's reputation. And also became symbolized with the degree to which Port-au-Prince was damaged by this disaster.
It's astounding to think of the damage that was able to take place in under 1 minute. Over 200,000 people were dead, about 1.5 million people were left homeless, and about $13 billion worth of damage occurred in the region, which is more than the nation's GDP.
The earthquake was ranked 7 on the Richter scale.
The Richter scale measures the strength of an earthquake. It's a logarithmic scale, and it goes up to a magnitude 9.
A 9.0 earthquake on the Richter scale is absolutely massive and catastrophic and would typically lead to multiple building collapses nearby or even long distances away. If it's a subsea earthquake, it would almost certainly trigger a tsunami of some sort.
While the 2010 Haitian quake was not the most powerful, it is considered the deadliest earthquake in the modern era. If not the raw power, then what made the 2010 Haitian quake so deadly?
So we know from Haiti's seismic history that Haiti has experienced infrequent earthquakes. 1751, there was a major earthquake that's been recorded in history, devastating local communities. And then roughly 20 years later, a similar but perhaps even larger earthquake that again triggered significant damage and disaster in the area it affected.
It's what's under Haiti that causes these quakes.
To understand the Haiti earthquake in 2010, you first look at plate tectonics, where the North American plate is butting up against the Caribbean plate, and of course sometimes grinding past without producing a large earthquake, and sometimes locking or sticking and building up stresses which are finally released in a larger earthquake. Underneath Port-au-Prince directly is a fault zone which is known as the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault, and that was the actual fault that ruptured in 2010.
The French might not have understood the science of earthquakes, but they knew the dangers of their new colony. After the destructive 1751 and 1770 quakes, the authorities restricted building with masonry and instead opted for wooden structures.
They recognized that there was a potential for large earthquakes, and they started using wooden structures rather than the stone structures that were common at the time. And we like wood as a material to deal with earthquakes. It's flexible and it's relatively lightweight.
But by the 20th century, the materials used in buildings changed.
For a couple of centuries, Hispaniola and Haiti continued to use wooden structures. But they eventually realized that wooden structures don't do that well in hurricanes and tropical storms. The wind is very hard on these buildings, the rain penetrates the buildings, it's not great for the occupants during these events. So in the 20th century, once we have widespread availability of concrete, Port-au-Prince starts to be built up with concrete structures. And unfortunately, they don't reinforce the concrete with steel. Steel is really expensive. It's not widely available in Port-au-Prince. It has to be imported, really high cost.
These unreinforced concrete buildings would create the deadly effect known as pancaking.
What makes concrete so unsuitable is that it's brittle. We want structures that are flexible and can bend and deform in the earthquake. But concrete doesn't do that. It's really, really brittle. Instead of bending, it breaks. But the problem with unreinforced concrete is it doesn't even do that. It doesn't bend, it fractures. And when it fractures, the columns can't support the slabs above it, and you get this pancaking effect that kills and injures tens of thousands of people in Port-au-Prince during this earthquake event.
At the time of the quake, Port-au-Prince was home to some 2 million people. Most worked and lived in unreinforced concrete buildings. Experts suggested that reinforced concrete structures could help protect Haitians from future earthquakes.
When we reinforce concrete with steel, it does quite a bit to increase the structural integrity of the building. The steel itself bridges between where we have pores of concrete. So we can't pour a continuous column of concrete straight up. So invariably we have what we call cold joints between each pore. Those act as weak spots that potentially could fracture. And where we go from a column to a floor slab, again, we have a weak point if we don't reinforce it, and a failure can occur there. With reinforcing concrete, we run continuous strands of steel through those joints. And basically, that steel reinforces those joints. Instead of those joints behaving in an entirely brittle manner, it gives them some flexibility.
While reinforced concrete works well to resist smaller earthquakes, stronger earthquakes need even more engineering. One country leading the way in earthquake resistance is Japan. By creating earthquake-resistant buildings that incorporate various seismic-resistant technologies and techniques into the design and construction process, including the use of seismic-based isolation systems, reinforced concrete and steel frames, as well as innovative architectural designs that increase the ability to withstand seismic activity. Additionally, strict building codes and regular seismic evaluations play a role in ensuring the safety and stability in the event of an earthquake. Unfortunately for Haiti, despite some efforts by the government and international organizations to improve building standards, many buildings in Haiti are still vulnerable to earthquakes. This is because of increased political destabilization, corruption, and neglect from the international community.
So much of our effort was focused on restoration and recovery that it's a very fair thing to investigate, to say, well, if and when the next thing inevitably happens, how will we respond a little bit differently, and how will we make this, our response, a more effective one for Haitians or anybody who's impacted by those events.
As the Haiti earthquake showed, disasters could strike quickly and without mercy, setting off a tragic chain of events. In the United Kingdom in 1941, a very different kind of disaster was unfolding, one that had the potential to catastrophically change history.
During World War II, Germany recognized that if they could interrupt England's war efforts, it would have a big effect on their ability to wage war in Europe. They have barrage balloons which make it difficult for aircraft to approach the city and drop their bombs. They have anti-aircraft guns which fire up and try to knock the bombers out as they're coming into the city. And they also have spotlights to highlight those aircraft as they're coming in so they can be attacked.
By 1940, cities, military bases, and naval yards were all targets for German bombers.
The Luftwaffe targeted civilian areas in its bombardment campaigns. It was both physical warfare as well as psychological warfare.
There is no real control for you to have. There's no way to escape it.
And of these targets, Liverpool was one of the most important.
So the Germans recognized that the port of Liverpool is critical to the British war effort, and so they start bombing it, trying to destroy that infrastructure.
Liverpool is first and foremost the city of the British Navy in World War II. That is where British troops set sail to land on the continent. That is where British naval ships set sail to patrol the Channel and the Atlantic. And that is where North American military aid entered the war through the British theater.
It was the center point for a large amount of critical import-export activity that a lot of wartime effort activities were hinged on, not to mention it was home to 800,000 people.
The first major air raid on Liverpool took place in August 1940, when 160 bombers attacked the city.
Unfortunately, Liverpudlians had become very accustomed to these nightly attacks and raids.
The people who would hear the sirens and have to go to a bunker at night, or would be up all night with long-term bombing all evening, would get up the next morning and go back to work.
The bombing raids had a deadly toll. Hundreds were killed in 1940, including 365 people during the infamous Christmas Blitz. But nothing could prepare Liverpool for what was coming next.
The May Blitz began in Liverpool in May 1941.
Unlike the Christmas Blitz of the previous year, the May Blitz was much more targeted on infrastructure and the war effort.
The idea was, with the increase in technology that's going on with planes, with bombers, with tanks, all of those things are required a manufacturing base. And the cities were that combination. Yes, they're civilians, but they were providing the economy and the infrastructure for the war effort.
The 3rd of May, the third night of the Blitz, saw the worst attack yet.
The full force of the Luftwaffe was unleashed upon the city, and the bombs began to fall.
Almost 300 bombers attacked the city of Liverpool, while thousands of people below cowered in any shelter they could find.
While the Germans are trying to demoralize the British with these bombings over and over and over again, in fact, it crystallized the British will behind Churchill to continue to fight the war.
Approximately 6,000 firebombs were dropped on the city.
And in the ensuing chaos, 150 Liverpudlians lost their lives.
Liverpool's docks were hard hit by the May 3rd bombing. Many of the cargo berths and ships were destroyed or on fire.
One incident on May 3rd involved the SS Malakand, a munition ship which was berthed at the Huskisson dock. The ship ignited thanks to firebombing by the Nazis, and its dangerous cargo posed a threat to the entire city.
Despite valiant efforts by the fire brigade to extinguish the flames, they spread to the ship's cargo of high explosives.
As the fire grew, the crew of the SS Malakand was evacuated, and eventually so were many of the fire brigades set to put it out.
By the morning of May 4th, the fire was out of control, and the ship exploded. Captain Kinley, the captain of the SS Malakand, was badly injured in the explosion.
Captain Kinley, who had been trying to extinguish the fire from the dock, was thrown against the side of a shed.
Others near, and even some who were further away, did not survive the blast.
When the Malakand explodes, it explodes like a giant bomb. It takes out a large number of the quays surrounding the ship and destroys a significant amount of the infrastructure in the port of Liverpool. Because of all the bombing that was going on in Liverpool at the time, it's tough to get an exact estimate of how many people were killed during the incident. However, it's estimated that 30 people died during the explosion of the Malakand.
The Malakand exploding when and where it did substantially impacted the wartime efforts.
During the Blitz, Nazi bombs destroyed 69 of 144 docks in Liverpool. The destruction of these docks severely crippled the British war effort and its domestic economy.
Liverpool was such a critical import-export supply chain site for the UK and for wartime efforts. So that explosion causing the damage meant that a lot of the goods and materials that needed to get to the front and support the wartime efforts couldn't make it to their endpoint or their destination.
But it wasn't just the docks that were targeted.
Much of the city lay in rubble. The cathedral had been destroyed, entire residential blocks had been reduced to ruin.
From May 1st to May 7th, 681 Luftwaffe bombers dropped nearly 900 tons of high explosives and more than 100,000 incendiary bombs on the city of Liverpool. By May the 8th, the Blitz had subsided. The German war machine had a new target.
Hitler had instead turned his attention to the Soviet Union and was planning a land invasion there. The cessation of bombing on Liverpool gave the people a breathing space to recover and prepare for the next phases of the war.
And for bomb-ravaged Liverpool, this was a chance to take stock of all that was lost.
During the 7-night Blitz, 6,500 homes were totally destroyed and a further 190,000 were severely damaged.
70,000 Liverpudlians lost their homes. During the course of the bombings, some 3,000 men, women, and children died.
Dealing with an internally displaced population is one of the most challenging aspects of managing any kind of emergency. Finding yourself in the situation of having to move and secure locations and also move these people and protect them is going to be very, very challenging.
Of all the devastation of the Blitz, the explosion of the SS Malakand sticks out. But was there a way to save the Malakand to prevent the explosion?
Interestingly, one of the causes of this explosion, the barrage balloon, was meant to actually be a security feature that backfired.
Barrage balloons were large unscrewed tethered balloons used to defend ground targets against aircraft attack. They worked by raising aloft steel cables, which pose a severe collision risk to low-flying enemy aircraft, making the attacker's approach more difficult. But these balloons had critical design flaws.
The major design flaw of the barrage balloons was that they were filled with hydrogen. Hydrogen is a highly combustible gas, and if it catches fire or is exposed to an ignition source, very quickly burns or explodes. And the choice to use this was a little bit strange in this situation because invariably the Germans were likely to bomb with high altitude aircraft, and the balloons themselves were going to be relatively ineffective at preventing the bombings and actually ended up causing a lot of damage on their own because of the hydrogen.
The barrage balloons had a range of 1,500 meters, but the Nazis used light and medium bombers during the Blitz that operated at nearly 9,000 meters, making the barrage balloons nothing but targets.
What actually ended up happening was, as the bombs were dropped, they would impact the balloons and damage the barrage balloons and either cause them to catch fire or deflate and fall to ground level, where they would then catch fire and catch other objects on fire, like the Malenkant.
And it was a barrage balloon that started the fire on the SS Malakand.
The barrage balloons over the Malenkant are going to be easily impacted by bombs. These are huge balloons. When a bomb impacts the balloon, one of two things are going to happen. Either the balloon is going to explode when the bomb hits it because the bomb itself explodes, or the bomb's going to pierce through the balloon, causing it to start to deflate and move downward to ground level. Again, these balloons are filled with hydrogen. If the bomb hits it directly, massive explosion, and the burning material of the balloon is going to fall to ground. If the balloon simply deflates, it's going to slowly move down to ground level, spread hydrogen and mix it with air at ground level, and then if there's an ignition source nearby, we get a hydrogen explosion at ground level and more fires. There's just no outcome that's good when you have a barrage balloon. If you wanted to use balloons, you should probably have used something like helium, which is non-combustible, won't catch fire, and wouldn't have led to the fires that occurred with the barrage balloons in Liverpool.
While safer gases used in the barrage balloons could have saved the Malakand, could modern firefighting techniques also have changed history?
One of the problems with liquid fuels is that we can't put it out very easily. If I have a puddle of burning gasoline on the ground and I spray water at it, because the gasoline is lighter and less dense than the water, it floats to the top, it keeps burning and all I do is spread it. So we need a different technology to put out burning liquid fires.
To fight fuel fires, fire safety services the world over use foam.
At the time of the bombing of Liverpool, we had foam-based systems, but the surfactants and the compounds that we had in the 1930s and 1940s really weren't up to making really resilient and strong foams.
The first firefighting foam was developed in 1902 by Russian engineer and chemist Alexander Loran. These early foams were limited in use, but by the late 1960s, the U.S. Navy had adopted the advanced AFFF foams that were much more effective.
Foams are really effective, but unfortunately the foams at this point in time really aren't that great. In more modern times, we've developed better surfactants that produce really, really strong bubbles that don't break down. We also use compounds that produce gases inside the bubbles themselves, which again are non-combustible and help extinguish the fire by separating it from the oxygen source. So modern foam-based systems are much better at putting out fires than what they had at the time of the Liverpool bombings.
While the destruction of Liverpool was man-made and could have been prevented with modern technology, some phenomena are beyond human control and on an astronomical scale.
A phenomenon that, to the vast majority of people is largely unexplainable. Forces acting on the Earth from far above is something that nowadays has largely lost its power to amaze or terrify. But in the middle of the 19th century, there's still very much a sense that something is happening from the unknowable above us.
In early September 1859, Richard Carrington, an amateur English astronomer, spotted something strange from his specially made brass telescope that allowed him to view the sun. Carrington saw something he wasn't expecting, a mass darkness floating around the sun.
The Carrington event fascinates me because it seems like one of the last periods when we could have mystery in the sky. Without Richard Carrington's telescope, it would simply be a series of celestial occurrences.
Throughout our time on this planet, humans have looked to the sky in wonder, in inspiration, and often we have looked to the sky in terror.
And the Carrington events, the solar flares, the strange auroras, the vividness of the sky in that year really reminds me that for much of our history on this planet, humans have stared at the sky in wonder and mystery.
On August 28th, the sun entered a period of frenzied activity. Sunspots had appeared on the surface, swarming and multiplying dark, cool patches. Solar flares had erupted, sending charged particles flying towards Earth.
Carrington would have been witnessing a coronal mass ejection, and that simply means a burst of material coming off of the surface of the sun. I mean, the sun doesn't really have a surface the way we understand it, but it can still blast material away in these huge explosions that we call coronal mass ejections.
Over the northern hemisphere, the aurora had glowed stronger than usual, shimmering in the skies from New England to Cuba.
The auroras were so bright that in Boston, people were finding themselves able to read the newspaper by the illumination of the night sky.
On the 1st and 2nd of September 1859, the northern hemisphere's night sky came alight with intensely bright auroras, shining and shimmering across the horizons at latitudes that had never seen the northern lights before.
If you're in Cuba, you're not seeing that very often, if ever. So to look up and see the aurora down that far, you wouldn't even necessarily know what the heck you're looking at. It would have been absolutely beautiful and amazing, but I can imagine it would be like, oh, okay, that's it, we're done. The Earth is done. This is the end of the world.
And could such a frightening event happen again?
A Carrington event is something that's likely to occur at some point in time. We know these periodically occur. We know that the sun goes through cycles where there's higher and lower activity. If a major coronal mass ejection occurs, it will have an impact on our technological society.
And the Carrington event did hamper the growing global communication network.
At that point in time, the first long-range telecommunication systems had been set up. We had telegraph wires running across North America. And what we saw was a lot of these telegraph systems shorted, causing small fires and damage to all of the telegraph equipment. Carrington said, this has something to do with electricity. What's happening with the sun and this material that's being blown past Earth, creating all of these auroras, there's something electrically active about it that's causing the damage to the telegraph system.
The Carrington event occurred over 160 years ago. While it was the most powerful solar storm to hit the planet, it was not the first, nor will it be the last.
The Carrington event was not a unique event. The sun goes through cycles of peak activity and then lower activity. The Carrington event just happened to occur during one of these many cycles.
Experts are divided on the frequency of major solar storms. Some believe they happen once every 1,000 years. Others believe we're due for another.
If a Carrington event happens again, and it likely will at some point, we lose our infrastructure.
There is historical precedent for these sorts of storms. We have records dating back hundreds of years of unusual auroras deep into the south sky.
So if that happens, what you find is that the individuals who can survive on their own, who have that more rugged and rural abilities, who know how to survive through camping in nature, they're the ones who are going to be able to use their skills to still maintain themselves.
The solar storms witnessed in 1859 and 1773 produced glittering night skies. But what exactly is the phenomena behind these solar storms?
In periods of high activity, we get these magnetic knots on the sun, and basically the magnetic fields on the surface of the sun become intertwined. And eventually, these magnetic knots break and then recombine. We lose the magnetic field on the surface of the sun that contains all of the energy and matter in the sun, and it's released into space. These are coronal mass ejections. Some of these travel at incredible velocities. These are traveling at fractions of the speed of light, which is beyond human comprehension. We just can't make things go anywhere near that fast.
Coronal mass ejections can take days to reach the Earth, and when they finally hit our planet's magnetic field, they trigger massive electromagnetic fluctuations.
What we have is a massive amount of charged particles blowing past the Earth at high speeds, and this has two effects. As those particles interact with our own magnetosphere and the ions in the top of our atmosphere, we get the auroras that form.
These fluctuations give us one of the main ways for measuring the intensity of a solar storm's DST, or disturbance storm time.
We are going to lose satellites. We're going to lose the ability to communicate via satellites. We'll lose the ability possibly to track hurricanes and tropical storms and monitor volcanoes for eruptions and all sorts of things. So it will have an impact on our daily lives. And in some areas, if the grid fails and we can't get it back up and running, those may be significant impacts.
In 1989, there was a much lower scale event that resulted in an outage in Quebec.
The 1989 Quebec geomagnetic storm was powerful enough to knock out Quebec's power grid for 9 hours.
Keep in mind, this was a minor event compared to the Carrington event, and it still took that long despite the really dedicated efforts of Hydro-Quebec to restore power.
Because of the potential for coronal mass ejections to cause issues with our electrical grids, we have FERC and NERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and NERC is the North American Energy Reliability Corporation. These two bodies are set up to basically make sure that there are safety features in our electrical grids such that coronal mass ejections really won't have massive impacts on our grids. So we put devices in and we regulate the requirement for those devices so that we don't get events like what happened in Quebec in 1989.
While these protections are now in effect in North America, other regions of the world are also readying their systems for a solar storm. While we work to strengthen our networks, no one knows what kind of damage a Carrington-level event would create.
Many electrical providers and other owners and operators of critical infrastructure that could be impacted by one of these events do have plans in place on how they can mitigate the impact. However, there is still a level of uncertainty.
In 2012, there was a near-miss Carrington-level event. After the 2012 near-miss, Lloyd's of London tried to estimate the cost of a modern Carrington event. They calculated damages of up to $2.62 trillion in the United States.
We know with the Carrington event that another similar magnitude event is a matter of when rather than if. The question is really more of a will we be prepared?
What an event like a Carrington event would cause, though, is the complete breakdown, and this will also include supply chains.
Solar storms can have a significant impact on things like our electrical infrastructure, telecommunications, and satellites, such as our global positioning system. So we have an idea of what the impacts could be, but it is kind of difficult to figure out what degree of magnitude could they be affected. Now, this is a hazard that our electrical providers are very much aware of, and we are not completely in the dark. Electrical providers and agencies such as NASA and the Canadian Space Agencies and other international agencies do monitor the sun's activity in the hopes of being able to provide warning in the event should one of these occur.
People get into a survival mode, and that shift will change the flavor of all interactions within the city.
As humanity faces global threats such as solar storms and climate change, the challenge is to engineer better and more robust systems, but also a cleaner world, not just for us, but for future generations.